The American Civil War between 1861 and 1865 represented the deadliest conflict in American history and most consequential internal struggle. Approximately 620,000 soldiers died through combat, disease, and starvation across 4 years of devastating warfare. The Civil War determined whether the United States would survive as unified nation or fragment into separate North and South. The conflict fundamentally transformed American society, slavery, federalism, and national identity. Understanding Civil War history illuminates American development and contemporary racial inequalities persisting from slavery's consequences. American slavery created irreconcilable sectional divisions. Northern states gradually abolished slavery through late 1700s and early 1800s. Northern economy developed through industrial manufacturing, commerce, and wage labor. Northern society became predominantly free labor based with wage workers replacing slavery. Southern economy remained dependent on slavery for agricultural production and wealth. Southern plantation owners accumulated enormous wealth through slave labor exploitation. Southern society developed hierarchies based on slave ownership, with planters dominating Southern politics and culture. Slavery became increasingly identified with Southern identity and economic interests. Northern opposition to slavery expansion into Western territories threatened Southern political power and future influence in federal government. Sectional identity hardened throughout 19th century as slavery debates intensified. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 temporarily reduced sectional tensions. Missouri entered as slave state, while Maine entered as free state, maintaining Senate balance between slave and free states. The compromise prohibited slavery in northern territories above 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude. This compromise delayed sectional conflict for decades, but created expectation of continued compromises. However, territorial expansion continuously reopened slavery expansion debates. Each new territory entering Union triggered slavery debates determining territorial status. California's admission as free state in 1850 upset sectional balance significantly. The Compromise of 1850 temporarily addressed disputes, allowing California admission, while strengthening fugitive slave law enforcement. These compromises proved temporary solutions, masking fundamental disagreements about slavery's morality and expansion. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 reignited sectional conflict intensely. The act allowed territorial settlers determining slavery status through popular sovereignty rather than congressional prohibition based on geographic latitude. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas territory, competing for political control and majority status. Violent confrontations erupted as settlers clashed over slavery's territorial future. Bleeding Kansas became symbol of sectional violence over slavery, demonstrating that peaceful political resolution might prove impossible. Kansas violence demonstrated that compromise could not resolve fundamental slavery disagreements. Political parties fractured along sectional lines. Republican Party emerged opposing slavery expansion, while Democratic Party split between northern and southern wings. Kansas violence accelerated sectional polarization, making civil war increasingly probable. The Doctred Scott decision in 1857 inflamed sectional tensions dramatically. Supreme Court ruled that enslaved African Americans could not sue for freedom because they were not citizens. Chief Justice Roger Taney's majority opinion held that African Americans had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. The decision prohibited slavery prohibition in territories establishing slavery's constitutional protection nationwide. The decision infuriated Northern abolitionists believing slavery expansion was inevitable and unstoppable. Southern leaders celebrated the decision believing slavery would expand indefinitely throughout America. The decision demonstrated that constitutional law supported slavery expansion and Southern interests. Northerners feared slavery, would spread to northern states, eventually threatening free labor ideology. Sectional animosity intensified following the controversial decision, as both sides questioned whether compromise remained possible. The decision radicalized moderate Northerners previously willing to accept slavery in existing states. The Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858 illuminated sectional divisions. Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debated slavery expansion during Illinois senatorial campaign. Douglas advocated popular sovereignty, allowing territories choosing slavery. Lincoln opposed slavery expansion, believing it violated free labor principles. Lincoln argued that slavery contradicted Declaration of Independence principles of human equality. Douglas defended slavery as acceptable when populations chose it. The debates gained national attention and revealed fundamental ideological divisions. Lincoln's rhetoric against slavery appealed to Northern free labor ideology. Douglas's pragmatic approach could not reconcile North and South's competing interests. Lincoln's debating prominence propelled him toward presidential candidacy. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 precipitated Southern secession. Lincoln opposed slavery expansion, though he did not initially advocate slavery abolition in existing states. Lincoln believed containing slavery's expansion would eventually eliminate it. Southern leaders believed Lincoln threatened slavery's existence fundamentally. Southern leaders feared Republican-controlled federal government would restrict slavery and impose Northern values. Southern states feared federal power would be used against Southern interests. South Carolina seceded from Union in December 1860, arguing Lincoln's election violated Southern rights. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed seceding by March 1861. 7 states formed Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis as president. Confederate states attempted peaceful separation, but federal government opposed secession, recognizing that Union dissolution threatened national stability and federal authority. Lincoln believed preserving Union was essential for democratic government survival. Fort Sumter attack in April 1861 initiated Civil War militarily. Confederate forces bombarded Fort Sumter, federal military installation in Charleston Harbor, demanding Union surrender. Federal soldiers under Major Robert Anderson refused surrender, triggering 4-hour artillery bombardment. No soldiers died in Fort Sumter attack, but the bombardment initiated warfare, transforming sectional conflict into armed struggle. Lincoln called for volunteer soldiers to suppress rebellion. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina seceded, joining Confederacy after Lincoln's call for troops. 11 states comprised Confederate states controlling Southern territories and resources. North and South mobilized for warfare. Both sides believed conflict would conclude quickly with few casualties. Both sides seriously underestimated warfare's duration and destructiveness. Early Confederate military victories boosted Southern confidence. Confederate forces defeated Union Army at First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861. Union commanders believed victory was certain, but Confederate forces prevailed after fierce fighting. Approximately 900 soldiers died at Bull Run, shocking Northern civilians expecting easy victory. Northern public celebrated despite defeat, believing war would end quickly. Southern leaders became confident of eventual independence and Northern defeat. Union realized that suppressing rebellion would require sustained military effort and prolonged conflict. Federal government mobilized military and economic resources for prolonged conflict. Union recognized that defeating Confederate Army would require overwhelming force and strategic patience. Union military strategy evolved throughout Civil War, reflecting strategic learning. Initial Union strategy focused on rapid military victory through direct assault against Confederate armies. Union commanders discovered Confederate armies could defend effectively using entrenchments and superior leadership. Union developed strategy of exhaustion attempting to deplete Confederate military and economic resources. Union pursued total war, destroying Confederate infrastructure and economy. Union recognized that defeating Confederacy required destroying its capacity and will to continue fighting. Union implemented brutal strategic policies, including destruction of civilian infrastructure and economic resources. Sherman's march to the sea embodied total war strategy. Union's strategy increasingly targeted civilian infrastructure and resources, sustaining Confederacy. General Ulysses S. Grant emerged as Union's most effective commander. Grant demonstrated strategic innovation combining military force with resources and logistics. Grant captured strategic positions along Mississippi River essential for controlling West. Grant won major victories at Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and Vicksburg, establishing himself as capable commander. Grant understood that Union's superior numbers and resources could defeat Confederacy through attrition and exhaustion. Grant accepted high casualties knowing Union could replace soldiers while Confederacy could not. Grant's ruthlessness and strategic vision proved instrumental to Union victory. Lincoln promoted Grant to commanding general, recognizing his effectiveness and willingness to fight. Grant coordinated multiple armies pursuing Confederacy's complete defeat. Confederate General Robert E. Lee became South's most celebrated military commander. Lee demonstrated tactical brilliance, winning victories against superior Union forces. Lee won major victories at Second Bull Run and Fredericksburg, defeating larger Union armies. Lee attempted invading North at Gettysburg in July 1863, seeking Southern victory on Northern soil. Lee's invasion was defeated at Gettysburg in a three-day battle. Gettysburg was Civil War's bloodiest battle with approximately 50,000 casualties. Gettysburg defeat prevented Lee from winning Northern support and supplies. Lee's later campaigns were defensive-reactive rather than offensive-strategic. Lee retreated continuously as Union forces advanced relentlessly. Lee eventually commanded Confederate armies in desperate defensive struggles. The Battle of Gettysburg represented Civil War's turning point militarily. Union forces defeated Lee's invasion army, establishing Union dominance. Union victory demonstrated that Confederate armies could be defeated decisively. Gettysburg, coupled with Grant's Vicksburg victory in same month, established Union momentum. Union never relinquished military initiative following Gettysburg. Confederate forces retreated continuously through 1864 and 1865. Confederate prospects for independence declined increasingly as Union advanced. Lee's surrender at Appomattox became inevitable after Gettysburg's defeat. Slavery emerged as central Civil War issue despite initial political reluctance. Abraham Lincoln initially sought preserving Union without addressing slavery. Northern abolitionists demanded slavery abolition as war objective. Enslaved African Americans escaped to Union lines demanding freedom. Union military discovered that enslaved people provided valuable labor and military service. Union recruitment of African American soldiers demanded addressing slavery status. Lincoln issued Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, declaring enslaved people in rebelling states to be free. The proclamation liberated millions of enslaved people in Confederate territories. Emancipation Proclamation transformed Civil War from Union preservation struggle into liberation struggle. Northern public increasingly supported war after emancipation became explicit objective. The Emancipation Proclamation's legal and political implications were profound. The proclamation applied only to enslaved people in Confederate territories. It did not address slavery in border states remaining in Union. However, the proclamation established slavery abolition as war objective. The proclamation promised freedom to enslaved people, providing freedom to millions. Escaped enslaved people sought Union Army protection. Union Army provided military and logistical support. Eventually, over 180,000 African American soldiers served in Union forces. Emancipation transformed Civil War into moral struggle against slavery. African American soldiers served in Union military in significant numbers. Approximately 180,000 African American soldiers served in Union Army during Civil War. Approximately 37,000 African American soldiers died during war. African American soldiers fought in segregated units under white officers. African American soldiers received lower pay and inferior equipment than white soldiers. Despite discrimination, African American soldiers demonstrated military competence and courage. African American soldiers fought particularly fiercely, seeking freedom and equality. African American soldiers proved themselves capable soldiers worthy of respect. African American military service demonstrated their capacity and commitment to freedom. African American soldiers' participation advanced claims for post-war equality and citizenship. The home front experienced devastating economic and social disruption. Union blockade of Confederate ports strangled Southern economy systematically. Confederate manufacturing capacity was insufficient for military production. Union destroyed Southern infrastructure, including railroads and factories. Southern civilians experienced starvation as resources were devoted to military needs. Inflation destroyed Confederate currency's value. Northern civilians experienced economic disruption and inflation. Women managed farms and factories, replacing males in military service. Northern industrial capacity increased during war, responding to military demands. Northern manufacturing expanded enormously, producing weapons, ammunition, and supplies. War production accelerated Northern industrial development and economic dominance. Southern industrial capacity remained inadequate throughout war. Civilian casualties and suffering increased dramatically as war escalated. Sherman's march to the sea destroyed Georgia's infrastructure and economy deliberately. Union forces burned crops, destroyed livestock, and demolished buildings. Civilian population experienced widespread destruction and starvation. Sherman believed destroying Southern capacity to wage war required destroying civilian infrastructure. Sherman implemented total war concept against civilian populations. Refugee crises created humanitarian catastrophes. Entire families were displaced by military operations. Civilian mortality increased from disease, starvation, and war-related violence. Civil War initiated total war concept targeting civilian populations and infrastructure. Subsequent wars adopted total war strategies against civilian populations. Medical conditions proved catastrophic during Civil War. Disease killed more soldiers than combat. Approximately two-thirds of military deaths resulted from disease. Dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia, and measles devastated army camps. Medical knowledge regarding disease transmission was primitive. Sanitation in army camps was inadequate. Medical treatment for wounded soldiers was limited and often ineffective. Amputation was common treatment for leg and arm wounds. Anesthesia was available, but pain management remained inadequate. Infection claimed many wounds that might have been survivable with modern medicine. Civil War generated medical innovations, including field hospitals and ambulance corps. Confederate economy collapsed under Union pressure. Southern manufacturing could not replace destroyed equipment and supplies. Confederate industry lacked capacity matching Union industrial production. Union blockade prevented Confederate importing supplies from Europe. Confederate currency became worthless through inflation. Confederate government faced financial crisis, unable to pay soldiers or purchase supplies. Southern soldiers deserted, increasingly seeking family survival. Confederate states experienced social breakdown as institutions failed. Confederate government lacked resources and authority maintaining order. Economic collapse coincided with military defeats, destroying Confederate morale and capacity. Starvation and economic collapse undermined Confederate military effectiveness. Western theater campaigning proved decisive for Union victory. Grant commanded Union forces in Western theater, controlling Mississippi River. Grant captured strategic river cities and maintained Union supply lines. Grant's victories at Fort Donelson and Shiloh demonstrated his military effectiveness. Grant's Vicksburg campaign established Union control of Mississippi River. Union control of Mississippi River divided Confederacy, separating Western Confederate states. Grant's success in Western theater established his reputation, enabling promotion to commanding general. Western theater victories provided Union momentum, accelerating toward total victory. Eastern theater campaigning remained costly and inconclusive longer. Lee defeated numerous Union commanders sent against him. Lee's victories inflated Confederate hopes. However, Lee ultimately lacked resources, defeating Union numerically superior forces. Lee's invasions of North, 1862 and 1863, failed. Lee retreated after each Northern campaign. Lee's defensive campaigns could not defeat Union. Grant's appointment to Eastern Command established new strategy. Grant accepted high casualties, pursuing complete Confederate defeat. Grant's approach proved more effective than predecessors' defensive caution. Sherman's Atlanta campaign demonstrated Union's combined arms strategy. Sherman commanded approximately 100,000 troops. Sherman pursued Confederate General John Bell Hood's army. Sherman captured Atlanta in September 1864. Atlanta capture demonstrated Union's ability defeating Confederate armies. Atlanta capture provided psychological boost to Northern public. Atlanta capture proved that Union could defeat Confederate forces decisively. Sherman's success encouraged Lincoln's re-election in 1864. Lincoln defeated General George McClellan, opposing continued war. Lincoln's re-election ensured continuation of war until total victory. Sherman's march to the sea demonstrated total war strategy. Sherman commanded approximately 60,000 troops marching from Atlanta to Savannah. Sherman's forces destroyed infrastructure, destroyed crops, burned buildings, and seized resources. Sherman's campaign stretched 300 kilometers through Georgia, destroying everything in Army's path. Confederate forces were powerless, stopping Sherman's advance. Sherman's destruction demonstrated Confederacy's inability protecting its own territory and population. Sherman's march crushed Southern civilian morale and military resistance. Sherman's tactics initiated modern total war concept. Sherman estimated destroying Southern property would reduce Southern willingness to continue war. Grant's final campaigns in 1865 overwhelmed Confederate armies completely. Grant commanded approximately 300,000 troops against Lee's 50,000 soldiers. Grant pursued Lee's retreating army relentlessly. Lee's army was exhausted, starving, and continuously defeated. Confederate soldiers deserted, continuously seeking families and survival. Lee's supply lines were severed by Union cavalry. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia on April 9, 1865. Surrender ended organized Confederate military resistance. Lee's surrender was followed by other Confederate commanders surrendering. Civil War ended through overwhelming Union military victory. Confederate hopes for independence proved futile. Abraham Lincoln's assassination on April 14, 1865 shocked the nation. John Wilkes Booth, Confederate sympathizer, assassinated Lincoln in Washington Theater. Booth believed Lincoln deserved death for slavery abolition. Booth shot Lincoln in back of head at close range. Lincoln died following morning after doctors' unsuccessful treatment. Lincoln's death deprived nation of leadership during critical Reconstruction period. Lincoln planned magnanimous Reconstruction, recognizing Southern need for rebuilding. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, proved less committed to civil rights and freedmen's welfare. Lincoln's assassination symbolized Civil War's deep hatreds and sectional divisions. Lincoln's death eliminated moderate Reconstruction approach. Civil War casualties exceeded expectations and comprehension. Approximately 360,000 Union soldiers died from combat and disease. Approximately 260,000 Confederate soldiers died from combat and disease. Approximately 620,000 soldiers total died during four-year conflict. Approximately 50,000 civilians died from war-related causes. Civil War death rate exceeded any American conflict before or after. More Americans died in Civil War than in all other American wars combined. Disease killed more soldiers than combat. Inadequate medical care, sanitation, and supplies created disease epidemics. Civil War demonstrated warfare's destructive capacity and human cost. Civil War casualties traumatized American society. Reconstruction period following Civil War attempted rebuilding Union and addressing slavery consequences. Reconstruction period lasted approximately 12 years from 1865 to 1877. Federal government attempted establishing black equality and rights in defeated South. Reconstruction governments established schools, hospitals, and civil institutions. African Americans voted and held elected office during Reconstruction. African American political participation demonstrated capacity for democratic participation. However, Reconstruction faced fierce Southern white resistance. Southern white terrorism targeted African American voters and officials. Ku Klux Klan engaged in racial violence against freedmen and Republican supporters. Democrats regained political control, eliminating Reconstruction initiatives. Reconstruction's failure established Jim Crow segregation, lasting until 1960s. Reconstruction amendments attempted establishing freedom and equality. 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout United States in 1865. 14th Amendment established citizenship and equal protection guarantees. 15th Amendment prohibited racial discrimination in voting. Amendments represented Civil War's fundamental achievements. However, amendments' implementation faced determined Southern resistance. Southern states developed Jim Crow laws circumventing amendment protections. Sharecropping replaced slavery, economically subjugating freedmen. Southern whites maintained political and social dominance despite constitutional amendments. Civil rights protections proved ineffective against Southern white determination. 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout United States in 1865. Amendment represented Civil War's fundamental achievement. Slavery had plagued America since colonial period. Slavery destroyed millions of human lives and families across centuries. Slavery's abolition ended institution, fundamentally contradicting American democratic principles. However, abolishing slavery did not establish equality or full freedom. African Americans faced severe discrimination and segregation. Legal slavery was replaced by economic exploitation and racial subordination. Sharecropping systems economically exploited freedmen. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation and discrimination. 13th Amendment achievement should not obscure ongoing racial oppression. Civil War transformed American federalism and national power fundamentally. Federal government emerged as supreme authority over states. States could not secede or nullify federal authority. Federal government expanded through military occupation and Reconstruction administration. Federal government established legitimacy over previously sovereign state governments. Civil War established national supremacy over state sovereignty. Federal government emerged as powerful institution shaping American development. National identity replaced sectional identities through Union victory. Federal government authority became accepted principle. Secession became permanently rejected concept. American federalism became centralized around federal government authority. Civil War accelerated American industrialization and economic transformation. Northern industry expanded dramatically, supplying military needs. Northern industrial capacity exceeded Southern agricultural economy. Northern factories produced weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and equipment. Northern railroad expansion facilitated military logistics. Northern industrial development created technological advantages. Industrial North established economic dominance. Southern Reconstruction attempted industrial development but failed competing with established Northern industry. American capitalism consolidated power through Northern industrial development. Economic inequality between North and South persisted through 20th century. Civil War established Northern economic dominance defining American development. Technological innovations accelerated through Civil War. Railroad transportation revolutionized military logistics. Telegraph communication enabled coordination between distant commanders. Ironclad warships introduced armored naval warfare. Mine explosives introduced to military engineering. Rifle technology advanced, creating longer-range, more accurate weapons. Trench warfare and entrenchments became standard military technology. Machine gun technology emerged. Repeating rifles increased firepower dramatically. Civil War stimulated military technology development. Civil War technologies influenced subsequent warfare worldwide. International implications of Civil War proved significant. European powers monitored Civil War developments. British and French considered recognizing Confederate independence. Confederate military victories encouraged European recognition consideration. Union victories discouraged foreign intervention. Union military superiority ultimately prevented European recognition of Confederacy. Union diplomatic efforts discouraged European powers from recognizing Confederate government. European powers remained neutral, maintaining trade relationships. Union blockade of Confederate ports created tension with European trading nations. However, European powers ultimately accepted Union victory. Secession crisis established permanent Union principles. Southern secession attempt demonstrated fundamental disagreement about Union nature. Union victory established that secession was illegal and impossible. Federal government's supreme authority became established principle. Secession was never again seriously attempted. Union established permanent political structure. Federal power over states became accepted principle. Secession crisis demonstrated that peaceful political separation was impossible. Union would be preserved through military force if necessary. Civil War consequences persisted into 20th and 21st centuries. Racial inequality persisted through slavery's aftermath and segregation. Southern economic development remained constrained by war destruction and slavery's economic consequences. Southern states remained poorer than Northern states through 20th century. Sectional divisions persisted in American politics. Civil War demonstrated constitutional system required national unity and supreme federal authority. Contemporary American society continues grappling with slavery's consequences through racial inequality and systemic racism. Civil War's unresolved racial issues persist in contemporary society. Civil War represented America's greatest internal crisis and transformation. War preserved Union and established federal supremacy. War abolished slavery, though emancipation proved incomplete regarding equality. War killed 620,000 soldiers, testing American democracy's survival. War demonstrated warfare's destructive potential, creating modern warfare concepts. War accelerated American industrialization, establishing economic dominance. War remains American history's most consequential internal conflict, reshaping national development. War created modern America. War established national identity, transcending sectional divisions. Civil War legacy shapes contemporary American society profoundly. Racial inequalities traced to slavery and segregation following Civil War. Southern and Northern regional differences persist from Civil War consequences. Federal authority versus state power tension remains from Civil War. American democracy's survival through Civil War tested constitutional system. Contemporary America remains shaped by Civil War's transformation. Understanding Civil War history remains essential, comprehending contemporary America and ongoing racial justice struggles. Civil War represented American civilization's greatest internal challenge and transformation, establishing modern America fundamentally. Civil War consequences remain central to American identity and development continuing into present.